Hello, my name is Clare Goldsberry, and I've just written a new book that will be out on November 16th called The Illusion of Life and Death. There's a foreword in here by Richard Smoley, who is an author and who is very well known, and I think you'll enjoy his foreword, as well as the book that I've written as an inspiration to people who perhaps don't understand very much about death and dying. I've heard it say that we can't really understand dying until we understand living and what life is. When we understand life and what living is, we can better understand what death is. And when we learn to live well, we can learn to die well, and vice versa. The inspiration for this book was the fact that I do think we can learn to die better in this country. It's such a difficult topic to approach. People don't really want to talk about death. And the fear of the unknown, of course, is the basis for our fear of death. And I think that we need to somehow get past that and learn more about what life is, what living is. And so during my exploration of religious, philosophical, and the quantum scientific studies of life and death, I've learned a lot. And I guess the thing that surprised me the most is that death is probably the one topic that down through the ages has been a mystery to people. Where do we go? How do we die? Where do we go when we die? And we look at death from the earliest sages and philosophers to the present. We see there's a common thread there. And perhaps people in ancient times died better than we do now because they were much closer to death. They were much closer to the dying process and people that were dying. Medical technology has given us perhaps a false, in many cases, hope for cures, treatments to prolong life, and means of bringing us back from death's brink and near-death experiences, as I talk about in the book. Fear of the unknown is still prevalent in the human consciousness in spite of all this medical technology. We still do not know how to die well or without fear, is how I would describe that, which means we don't know how to live well. And that too is without fear. The book is divided into 4 parts to kind of help guide us through this process, this discussion of dying and death. What is life is the first part. I explore consciousness and what it means to live consciously. What is mind? Is mind the brain? A lot of people still connect mind and brain as the same thing, and yet I look at mind as the software where brain is the hardware. How does mind create all of our phenomenal experience? What is reality? What is reality? How do we know that what is around us is real? And I think when you look at this topic of reality and how mind creates our phenomenal experience, I think we have to go back to the Buddhist idea and the quantum physicist idea as well, that all is created in the mind by the mind, and nothing has any inherent reality from its own side. For that reason, we get attached to things because we believe everything in our phenomenal experience is real. We get attached to the material world, we get attached to our possessions, our relationships, and most of all, our bodies. We're attached to our bodies probably more than anything because we don't want to lose our bodies. And that makes both living fully and dying well and dying peacefully, it makes it very difficult. The liberation of non-attachment is a good practice. And I think anyone can practice non-attachment, even though it's an Eastern philosophical practice. I think learning to embrace what is and learning not to be attached to our lives, our bodies, and just embracing what is and learning to enjoy life and learning to have a good death. Part 2 of the book looks at illness, old age, and death, and why so many continue to search for the fountain of youth and ways to help people live longer than the 100 years that we currently are living. That's about the max, although people do live longer than 100 years. As if the longevity of beyond 100 years is some kind of bonus years. And the cost of keeping people alive, I look at that because it is, medical technology is great, but it also costs money. And the cost of keeping people alive is becoming greater. Brent, my significant other, who was diagnosed with esophageal cancer and given 6 months to a year to live if he had all the treatments, surgery, radiation, chemotherapy, the outlook wasn't real great. And so he decided early on that because he considered his diagnosis just another adventure in his life, he considered that he would have the surgery, but he didn't want to have radiation, chemotherapy, anything that would not allow for him to live his life, whatever time he had left, to the fullest. And so that's the way he did. He lived 18 months after his diagnosis. He worked, we traveled, things were good, and that's the way he wanted it. He always felt that, what good is a longer life if it is a life that cannot be lived without pain and suffering. And a lot of times we've seen that the treatments for some terminal illnesses are often result in people not being able to live the life they want to live. And it is more pain and suffering. Part 3 is looking deeper into death. This is where I talk about near-death experiences. I give several examples of people that I've read about, people that I have known personally that had a near-death experience. I also talk about another very difficult topic when it comes to death and dying, and that is choosing death. Choosing death through suicide. It's become such a phenomenon, and especially among younger people, it's very difficult for people to discuss the topic of suicide. But we shouldn't denigrate the act of suicide. There's my thoughts on assisted suicide are included in this chapter, in this section. And what about assisted suicide for those who are very ill, very old, who feel like that they can't go on? And it's not just older people, but even younger people or middle-aged people who have a devastating event in their life that they feel like that their life is not worth living anymore. And that's for each individual to decide. Another person cannot decide that for them. But we look at that and how long should our body support us? And sometimes that becomes a very difficult topic for people. But I think it's worth looking at. We hear of even famous people committing suicide, and we think, well, they had everything. Why would they do this? And it's something that we'll never know, because obviously we'll never know another person's mind. So we can't judge that. I had a friend recently whose 21-year-old son committed suicide. And it was 2 years ago, and it's still very difficult for her to this day. So it is a very difficult topic to speak of, but I include it in the book because I think it's an important thing to discuss. Part 4 explores the various beliefs in what happens after death. Where do we go if we go anywhere? I know the Dalai Lama often talks about dying and sleeping. It's like the deep sleep when we go to bed at night and we fall into this deep sleep. Dying is a lot like that. And how can we have a good death? What is a good death? A death without fear, a peaceful death. We hope that everyone would have a peaceful death. A death without regrets, a death without attachments to the material things of this life. About 4 months before Brent died, he bought a new Corvette. And I think people thought, well, he's very materialistic. He buys a new Corvette just before he dies. But he just wanted to have, a last fling in his Corvette. And in fact, one Sunday morning, the hospice nurse had dropped by to check on him. And she asked him what he was going to do. And he said, well, I'm going to take the Corvette out on the freeway because Sunday mornings is pretty light. And I like to get the vet up to 100 miles an hour so that I can have, fun during my last, however much time I have left. And she said, well, you better be careful. You might get a ticket. And he said, well, that's okay because I'll be dead by the time I have to go to court. So he always was this very funny guy that had a very good outlook on his own death. And I think that's what, because he had so much fun living and he had no fear of life, he always embraced what is. He was a kind of go with the flow kind of person. And I include a lot of things about Brent. I kept a journal. And so there's a lot of stories about Brent and the process that he went through that I'm hoping will be helpful for other people. I'd like to read just a little section from the book that talks about what how Brent died. It was the day before he died, and I was sitting by the hospital bed that we had in the family room. And we're just sitting there by him, and he was just being very quiet. And all of a sudden he said, how easy it is. What's easy? Dying? I asked him. Yes, he replied softly. Dying is so easy. I thought it would be harder than this, but it's so easy. Well, that's probably because you're not afraid to die, I told him. People who are afraid to die often have a terrible time dying. It's easy for you because your life was easy. You were never afraid of anything. Several times he looked up and asked, am I dead yet? No, not yet, I'd reply. Oh, I thought I was dead. No, you're not dead, I reassured him. Besides, if you have to ask me whether or not you're dead, it's a pretty safe bet you're not. And I laughed, and he smiled softly, drifting off into that other realm, eyes half closed as if in meditation. He was seeing many things, but not of this world. He smiled and moved his lips as if talking to someone somewhere else. He had smiled so much during the past 2 weeks. You're happy? I said to him. Yes, I'm happy, he said, smiling at me. Later that afternoon, he took his last breath and died. The one thing everyone can do for someone who's nearing the end of their life is to embrace the process and realize that all is perfect. All is as it should be. And not to be afraid of what happens when we die. Not be afraid of the dying process. Some of it is a bit difficult to watch, but I do believe that there is value in the dying process. I believe that we just go from life to life. And I would hope that if you read this book, and I hope you will read the book, I hope you buy the book. The Boulder Bookstore is a wonderful bookstore. I've been there several times when I've been visiting friends in the areas, and it's really a magnificent bookstore, actually. And I hope you will go there and buy the book And I hope you get a lot of meaning out of what I've written. Maybe it'll give you a different perspective on life and death. I hope so. And I wish you the best. And thank you very much for listening to my video.